a question that I think applies to virtually all the talks and a lot of the questions, and maybe is on the minds of a lot of people in the room, which is, as a historian of psychology and also religion, and the intersection of the two, given that there's been dream analysis and the contemplation of dreams and consciousness in every culture, certainly in Western culture since biblical times, and right through the 19th century, through Freud onward, and sleep, dreams, consciousness has always been a part of literature. And at the same time, in the modern world, the therapeutic uses of dreams and the study of consciousness toward ameliorating human suffering, psychic suffering, has been a big part of the adventure of psychology. I'm just wondering, there wasn't a lot of talk about application, so to speak, or next step. For instance, lucid dreaming. How does this differ strikingly in perhaps its therapeutic uses? I must say, I kept on, because of just my natural way of doing things, kept on comparing what we were hearing about lucid dreaming to kind of Freudian approaches of dream analysis or Jungian approaches to dream analysis. That's just an example, but in general, the talk I felt most close to was your talk, because James imagined multiple universes, imagined the realities of the unseen, as he called it, yet left the questions wide open. I'm just wondering, though, what is the next step, or what are possible ways to go with the kinds of openings we've heard about today?
Yeah, it's a good and very broad question.
Of course.
Yes, yes. I think I could address some part of it in terms of the idea of lucid dreaming application for how it can be beneficial to people. I kind of hinted a little bit about it with the Gary Larson cartoon and the idea of reframing experience and saying that we're going to try to bring a different heart, a different mind to the situation we find ourselves in. And that's what we can do because we recognize our state. Say, oh, here's a special opportunity for me to try a different way of being. And we don't ordinarily have that. And to explain that, I have to put it in the context of my own experience while learning lucid dreaming. In the first 6 months of my journal that I referred to there, 60% of the lucid dreams I had were initiated by anxiety. So there was some kind of nightmarish situation where I'm running away from the police, the angry mob, the underworld, pretty much always the same story, getting away from the undesirables. And what do I do with my lucidity? Is, well, I can fly above it all, right? So I fly above it all, and that's, what a way to go, huh? And this is after maybe 60 lucid dreams along the way. I had a dream in which I was, again, using my new ability to avoid better, and climbing down a skyscraper like a lizard and getting away from something dangerous and flew off. And then I woke up in a setting like, suppose I was listening to a lecture by a teacher I really respected, Idris Shah, talking about Stephen's dream. And he said that it was good that Stephen realized, because he was dreaming, that he could fly. But too bad he didn't yet realize that because it was a dream, there was nothing to flee. Okay? And you know, in the moment, of course, I hear this, I realize, oh, I've been going wrong. This has been crazy. The whole approach that I had of avoiding better, you know, with my new powers of lucidity. And that I then changed my attitude to say, next time, in the future, anytime I realize I'm dreaming, I'll ask, is there anything I'm avoiding in this dream? And if there is, I will resolve to go back and face it. And if also knowing what a slippery guy I am, it wasn't enough to do that, because I said, and if other people are fighting, I'll make myself the peacemaker, because otherwise it's not my problem, you know, they're doing it. And so it was just a change of orientation. That's what I'm going to do instead of what my habit has been. And as a result of that, then I experienced, I think, extraordinary lucid dreams with the different attitude of saying, here's what this is an opportunity for, is that there's some conflicts, some part of myself, presumably, that I'm trying to get rid of or get away from or disown. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to accept it. And so that this process of accepting, increasingly developing more and more, it's all me, essentially. And that then led to, for example, this situation, which is the most obvious one, was I am in the midst of a riot in a classroom, and here, suppose everybody pick up a chair and strike your neighbors with it, and generally you'd be rioting, but up at the front, I am in the grip of a 10-foot-tall ogre, and he's got me, and I'm trying to get away from this, and I have the thought that, now, this is a fairy tale figure, if I've ever seen one, a shadow figure, right, a la Jung. You know, it's an ogre, you know, and he just, I decide I've got to befriend him. I'm going to, you know, somehow make peace with him. And I look at him, you know, trying to say something nice, and I feel overwhelming revulsion and disgust. And just, not working. So I remember love. What's that? Oh, right, love. And then I look at him, and then something different happens. Words of flowing, of loving acceptance intuitively flow out of me, and the ogre melts into my heart and becomes one with me, and the riot disappears, and I wake up from that feeling more integrated in some way. And so you can sort of see the mechanism of finding a lucid attitude that is a way to respond to the dream content that then is not a matter of control. It just then triggers some response, and it happens, and it is natural and intuitive. And learning to do that, to actually bring myself to, you know, overcome those, you know, sort of mistaken attitudes I want to do, the superficial thing, find another way, was an incredibly important key to doing. And when I did that, then my frequency of nightmares went down from the 60% to 5% to less than 1%. I pretty much learned that when I have a nightmare, I'm doing something wrong. I'm making a mistake of not seeing the situation of what to do with it somehow. And that's the kind of approach that I think is a kind of a matter of integration, of making oneself whole, where we have over time divided ourselves into pieces, of the pieces that are rewarded, and, you know, the ones that, you know, I'm the good one, and versus the bad one. The bad one, I'm sorry, is the other guy, you know. And that attitude, of course, is a major cause of the problems of the world, is that we project all that onto the rest of the world. So it's like world peace starts at home, and you can do that in this lucid dream state. So I think it's an incredibly powerful opportunity, and it's something like a Western dream yoga, because it doesn't have any other assumption in it other than whatever you meet in your dream, that's a part of your dream. You know, and to assume otherwise is to think that other forces somehow get into your dream world, you know, like those, you know, thoughts being projected by somebody else, right? But if you simply accept whatever it is my world, then it's a powerful means of development. So that's what I'd really love to see more people experience that, and to see how powerful a technique that is. And because you do it just once to see that, and you see an immediate change with your attitude. As you change your attitude of how you're treating the other, they change instantly. And that's something you don't see in this life that fast. You know, it's probably the same truth, but it's kind of a Buddhist ideal, you might say, that you're seeking the welfare of all sentient beings. And as for the sentient beings, you're not, I decided I don't have to ask for your reality papers either. So, you know, I'm going to assume that each person, each entity I encounter is a sentient being, is as worthy of love and acceptance as I am, instead of saying, well, I'm not sure you're real. Yeah, so it's an interesting set of possible experiments you can do with the way you live in that state. And it then comes down to responsibility for your life is all yours in that state, because there's nobody else there. In every other world, it's an interaction, it's an agreement what we make with other people, but there it's yours, and what would you do? So that's, I think, a challenge that we'd love to see more.
Well, just to continue on that theme for a moment and take it out, as you were alluding to, that, you know, when we talk about owning our own or connecting with our own shadow side, that really is that's a global thing, and it applies to all of reality. And as I was kind of saying at the end of my presentation, I believe that everything that contemporary biophysical science is showing us has to do with deeper appreciation of a vast interdependent interconnectivity, and that all of these potential openings into using studies of consciousness to probe into new areas of the nature of mind and so forth will only reveal that more and more, that there's a deep interconnectivity between, we have this separation between mind and matter, which I think is a little simple, but that there's a deep interconnectivity going on there, and a deep capacity of mentality to interact with the physical world in ways that we don't know how to describe at all yet in our science, and we either dismiss them as things that are not happening, or we attribute it to religious belief and stuff like that. I mean, you mentioned the connection between your interests in the history of science and psychology and religion, and I've alluded to this conversation that can be more nurtured in those areas. I mean, it's really interesting to think about, and I have a friend and colleague who's at Rice University here, Jeff Kripal, who's Well, so Jeff is a professor of religious studies, and his whole thesis, you know, as a comparative religion guy, like, you know, you're interested in, you know, all of these religious beliefs and how they're the same and different and where they came from and all of that. And the usual academic stance is that these are just crazy myths from the past that people made up for various reasons, and how can we study that academically? Well, his thesis is, you know, maybe they're based in reality in this way and that way, and how can we perhaps take that seriously? And if things were happening in those realms 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, maybe they still are. Maybe they're manifesting in different ways now, and we tend to dismiss that stuff as paranormal or whatever, but you can actually attempt to do science around all of that. And I think that's where the real future of consciousness studies is, although you can't say that you can maybe get away with saying that in a religious studies department, but if I say that in my department, you know, it doesn't get a lot of enthusiastic support. But I believe that is really the future of consciousness studies if we're going to go to new places.
Well, that's the beauty of tenure. By the way, just to say that one of the things I hear both of you saying, and then I'm going to pass this on quickly, is it's not, these aren't new, these new frontiers, whether it's lucid dreaming or this continuing scientific knowledge that is building up about the limitless complexity of the human mind, also integrates all of human historical experience culturally, and therefore that those borders, it's, you know, what you're doing is brand new, but it also reflects, I mean, I listened to you, and it's reflecting religious values, spiritual values that have been around for a long time, but it's a new doorway to them. It's a new doorway to them. Other comments?
I have two comments. One comment is as I've learned about lucid dreaming, as I've been developing this conference, actually over a couple of years and spoken to a number of people, it amazes me how people, the ones I've spoken to, have had lucid dreams, don't know they've had lucid dreams, but invariably they've used lucid dreams to advance the good. When you think of the freedom in a lucid dream, all the horrible, vengeful things you could do, all of the destructive things you could do. And people do that, but they turn towards love, flying. It's truly remarkable. I think it says something wonderful about at least some basic part of human nature, that this is in us. That this is the go-to state, because you have all that freedom, and you could go either way. That's one comment I wanted to make. The other is there is a culture war going on, and it is really amazing how powerful reductionism, it's called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, the spirit of abstraction, the marginalizing of human experience, pushing the humanities away from science, is still very, very active and very strong. And I can tell you that if you're a young person and if you have tenure, you can say what you want. If you're a young person and you want to develop a career, the best thing to do is to say that this is all nonsense. That's the way it works. That's the politics of it all. And struggling with that is a huge struggle that I think is timely, because the door more and more is opening up to these multiple perspectives, historical perspectives, narratives. It's coming on and on and on, but it still is not reflected in the halls of power in academia, I must sadly say. And I'm not sure what we can do about that other than to have these meetings and pursue these topics. And we are going to have a larger meeting on the subject of human consciousness here in Austin in a year or two, and we have other plans as well. And I just welcome your participation in this ongoing struggle. I think it's wonderful, Dr. Presti, that you have this relationship between Tibetan monks and Western science. This is what our age can afford, this kind of further communication and opening the doors to just histories of human wisdom which we've marginalized.
Okay, so I got in late, and so I'm not completely following the discussion. I ask your permission to talk anyway, despite not really being completely updated on what was discussed. I just want to share some ideas from I think the general perspective of anthropology. So as it was said, I am an anthropologist and I study traditional drug use or psychedelics, ritual, religion, shamanism associated to drugs, or which, you know, it's very kindred to sleeping. Like there is not such a great division between the use of psychedelic drugs and the role of dream and revelation, because a lot of revelation in shamanism occurs through dreaming. And, you know, a lot of the chants or the musics are inspirations, or the call itself to be a shaman derives from dreaming, from vision. So this idea of a vision that inspires and informs the reality is the larger topic of my research and my interests. And I just want to throw some ideas out there and start by telling a little anecdote. So I'm here because I'm in Austin because I'm doing a film with Ellen, who is there. She's a filmmaker, Ellen Spiro, from the UT Film and TV and Radio Department. It's called the Sacred Plants Chronicles. And we went filming in Huautla de Jimenez in Mexico, which is this famous town of Maria Sabina, who was visited by Gordon Wasson in the 50s and brought about the knowledge on magical mushrooms that are now being used. You know, the active principle psilocybin is being actively researched in different points in the U.S., like Johns Hopkins and NYU, UCLA. And we were talking to this local people and interviewing them, and we participated in a velada, which is a ceremony that you take the mushrooms. Normally, I don't talk a lot about my personal feelings, but and experiences, but it's important for my anecdote. So I had this experience that I saw a lot of silver. I saw silver and silver and silver and magical lands of silver. And I was very blown away. And I asked this guy, I said to him, he was like a local Mazatec, and I said, I saw all this silver, and what does this mean? Does this exist? And he started to laugh at me. He was laughing. I said, why are you laughing? And he said, of course this exists. Like, to him, the very question, my question was silly, to ask if that existed. And I thought that this is just a fantastic, epistemological break on worldviews, because to him, the idea that I would challenge that these things are real or exist seems, like a child in a way, like a kind of a silly question that somebody that has information about life would ask. So if you go from this tiny tip story and, understand a larger context, we basically understand life as there is a reality that is real and that is related to matter, and it's related to materiality, to what you can touch, to what is objectified. And then you have other variations which would be maybe pathologies, like visions or revelations or inspirations. Like you have this one, dominating state of being alert, which some authors have also called some kind of like cognocentrism, like the only legitimate state of being is the alert, rational state. And that is the main state. And all the other states, there are smaller variations or less important. So this conference would talk about these other states. So we're being progressive by addressing other states that are not the vigilant state, the rational state. So this hierarchy of states where just rationality and objectivity and materiality are legitimate is a very small, specific worldview, which is the Western worldview. And if you think historically and in terms of different groups and different times of history, this is really a minority. So the idea that you have a predominant reality, that is this reality that we are here, and that this is the real reality, whereas the others are variations or pathologies, it's a very reductionistic perception of all the potentialities that we have as human beings. And basically what unites, Amerindian shamanism throughout the Americas is this idea that this reality that we see, in fact, is just the apparent reality. This is the immediate reality. But that there is another reality, which is the invisible reality, which is actually more real than this reality. This reality is just what we grasp. But in fact, the invisible reality is what unites all of us. And this invisible reality can be accessed through things like dreams or drugs. So what is this invisible world that is actually the real world? So the world that we are in is an illusion of the real world. The real world, in this real world, there is another division. So we understand ourselves as there is culture, there is materiality, so we have everything that is material and different cultural appropriations, but other things outside humans are not culturally alive, let's say. They are just matter. For these societies, everything, rivers, mountains, the sun, plants, human beings, dogs, they are all human beings. They all have culture. They all have intentionality. They all have subjectivity. They all have their habits. So the family of the plants, the family of the dogs, the family of the rivers, they have names, they have personalities, they have histories, they have parties, they have jealousy, they have belongings, they have traditions. And when you take drugs or you dream and you access this other world, and then you see that all of us and everything is in fact made of the same thing. And this same thing is not matter, because our matter is different. My body is different than the body of a dog and the body of a fly. But we are all humans in this profound sense. We all have culture, we all have identity, we all have intentionality. So doing doing psychedelic drugs in rituals or dreaming is accessing this other world, which is normally not apparent for us. And there is nothing metaphorical about it. It's literal. So it's going to these other realms and literally changing perspective and wearing the lenses of this other reality. I don't know if I'm going too much and being a little bit too intense for, for everybody, but anyway, the idea that I wanted to share is that the very idea of maybe lucid dream doesn't make a lot of sense, perhaps in this traditional worldview, because it would be, of course, this is a big generalization, but actually when you take these substances and you have these revelations, or when you have a dream, you literally go to this other reality and experience reality like that. So it's not symbolic. It's about accessing this other dimension that exists. If a person has a dream telling a message, it's not like assessing my symbolic side, but it's actually going to this other dimension of reality, which is not apparent, but is considered real and predominant and important. So I think that the role of dreaming has another, it's much more central, because it's an important way to have access to this wider perspective of what is reality and what is actually that guides what we are and who we are. I just want to finish by giving one last idea, that when you say that if I have a vision, I actually went to this other world, or if I had a dream, I went to this other world, I transformed into a jaguar, I went into the spiritual world, I got in touch with my ancestors. But dreaming and hallucinating or having visions are also not seen as always real, because even though epistemologically they are real, but there can also be tricks. I don't know if you understand. So sometimes the visions are real as a epistemology. The dreams are real as epistemology, but sometimes you just may get a trick and a false vision, or you may get a dream that is a lie. So it's different than thinking that these things in principle are not real and are pathological. What I'm meaning to say is that because you had a vision or a dream, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's true, because you can also be cheated, and that can also be not true. They are true in principle, but sometimes they are not true. So.
I'm just wondering, since we've all had a little bit of a say, why don't there are any questions outstanding from the rest? Yeah.
With sleep apnea and any impairment with regular sleep, where you're interrupted constantly, does that make lucid dreaming easy, or does it make it very difficult?
I think we better defer to Dr. LaBerge on the issue whether it makes lucid dreaming easier or harder. Some sleep apnea patients get hypnagogic hallucinations, and presumably the reason is because they've been so REM sleep deprived that there's tremendous pressure to have REM. But that's a little bit different topic than lucid dreaming.
I think I could say that I know some people with sleep apnea and who are very interested in lucid dreaming. And generally it seems like there's an occasion it can be helpful, because there you are awakening multiple times. But the main rule seems to be that you need to be getting enough sleep in the first place, because it takes energy to be lucid, because it's not an automatic process. It takes attention. So if you are just too tired because you're not getting enough sleep, then that's not optimal for doing it. And remember, I mentioned one of the key things about the Hawaii thing is, number one, it's a vacation. We relax. So people then, and that's much closer to what's required for lucid dreaming being easy. It's not that you're on the edge of sleep and just don't have enough. You gotta have the energy. So.
Other, let's see, yeah. Can you pass that down?
I'm curious about whether all of you or any of you is aware of how closely in describing the the interaction between the sleeping and the conscious state, you're also describing the interaction between the conscious and the psychotic state. Whether, how, and if you are aware of that, what is your approach to insanity? Insanity has so many of the qualities that you all have described of, the intrusion of the REM, the pharmacological change of behavior and perception, the hallucinations that don't result simply from the introduction of a psychedelic drug or from sleep, but from the actual product of the brain itself. What do you do with that? What part does it play in your thinking?
I guess I might answer that. Yeah, the first thing I would say is that we're exploring these phenomena, hopefully for the first time methodically and scientifically, and everything has good effects and bad effects, and I think we need more data on that. I think that certainly is the fear that these substances, these states, these dream, if you start exploring beyond what's in everyday reality, insanity lurks. And that may be the case for some people. And I would say that even in the psychedelic studies using substances to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, which are now highly regarded and supported, there's screening, there's caution. One of the problems with the cultural exploration, the cultural explosion of the 60s and 70s, would have just came out of nowhere onto the street, and people took drugs and stepped off balconies, and I think there's an enormous amount of fear. I think we need to know. The other comment that I want to make, though, is that as a psychiatrist, which I am, if I'm going to say one thing about serious mental illness, the one thing that it has in common is unbelievable loneliness. Different forms that it may take, but there's just a tremendous sense of nobody will listen to me. Whether I'm in a terrible pit of despair, or whether I'm a genius who owns this building, or whether I'm a whatever, everyone is looking at me like there's a sense of rejection. And the essential sense that is shared is this terrible, terrible sense of loneliness. And I think we're talking about a very social phenomena here, are we not, Stevens? So there's a lot of fear, which I think would require, serious studies. Let's get some data. Let's see the risks, the advantages. Everything has risks and advantages. Are there people who are vulnerable to trouble and other people who are not? And that's a good question. But then the second thing is, I think we're dealing with fear from the past, which is, let's be prudent, but let's be open. And I think we are more open now, and the studies that have been done have been helpful in making us more comfortable. But I think we want to move slowly. And then again, we're talking about something that is so social. For me, that's the break between the terrible loneliness that comes with serious mental illness. Wally, do you have a comment about this?
By the way, that was a great point, and I've never thought about the essential loneliness in the psychotic state. Yeah. Well, at the place that Dr. Schwartz and I worked at the NIMH, there were a lot of studies focusing on this relationship of sleep and dreaming to psychosis, and one of them may have been a little bit naive, but what they did was, there's this idea going back to the ancient Greeks that the madman is a waking dreamer, is the sort of the way it was usually phrased. So now with the discovery of REM sleep, one idea was to deprive a schizophrenic person of REM sleep, because in principle, that would push the pressure for REM greatly increase, and it should become much sicker if in fact he's having REM-like experiences in the waking state. That's what hallucinations are. So anyway, we actually did that, and it had no effect on the degree of sickness whatsoever. So it seemed to argue, and in fact, as I mentioned in terms of depression, you know, there's a tiny little bit of data that REM, inhibiting REM actually can be good for you in a number of ways. So it's not so simple. It used to be thought in the years immediately after the discovery of REM sleep that depriving a person of it could be terrible in all sorts of ways. And it was around the years of the Korean War, and there was all this stuff about making people into zombies or spies by sleep depriving them. There was kind of thinking all around that line. So the general notion was that it would make you worse. And perhaps aided by that spirit, there were a series of studies at Stanford, or papers from Stanford seemed to say that REM depriving normal people can make them temporarily psychotic. And it actually gained tremendous popularity in the public imagination. The only trouble is it basically wasn't true. It seemed true at the time, but as the years went on, it became less clear. I mean, to give you an example, they gave many case reports of individuals who apparently became psychotic, and one famous one was a guy who was kind of a Casper milquetoast, very quiet, introverted, inhibited guy, and that after REM deprivation in the laboratory, he became psychotic. Well, 20 or 30 years later, as people went back and reviewed these, it turned out that what he had done is after the end of the study, he said something about he was going to go to a restaurant and then cheat the waitress out of her tip or something. And well, it was a little bit loose thinking, and it was very uncharacteristic of him. But to call it psychotic, was pushing it, and so it actually became less clear that was true. And then, as I say, in the years went on. Now you move up to the 80s. Studies seem to indicate that in certain situations, REM deprivation can actually be good for you in terms of depression. So it's a complicated issue.
Just want to say that from the perspective of what I was talking about a little bit, Amerindian perspective is, so if there is this reality which is apparent and you have another reality, and when you through certain ways you can access this other reality, either dream or drugs, and then you can incorporate the perspective of that reality. So this is important and valid as long as you can do the transit back. So this is a transitional state where you go and you exercise seeing the world as through the eyes of a tiger or of a shaman, of a pig, of a river, but you always come back. And so it's a journey that has dangers. It's therapeutic, it's healing, but it's potentially dangerous. And you can maybe do the journey and not come back. That would be what we call madness, or maybe for them you could transform into a jaguar and not come back as a human, or transform into an ancestor and don't come back, so die. So I think that this is the important characteristic of this is that it's relational and transitional. It's not a permanent state. I think if you were just constantly dreaming and seeing things from this other world and you were not coming back, then you would, lose it for us.
But psychosis is not necessarily a negative experience, and it's also something that you can come back from. So I should have clarified in the beginning to say that I'm not speaking of psychosis in the traditional Western interpretation as insanity, as the other, as the horrible non-consciousness, as another mode of experience very similar to what all of you have described. It's simply a term that we have such strong negative associations with that we don't.
And the question is, how can we find a space where we can explore consciousness, which is, after all, our mode of access, and access to what? Who are we? We have all these different cultural and traditional and historical traditions. You know, Wallace and I were just mentioning, there was a point where the NIH threw out all the anthropologists because they weren't scientists, you see? This culture war, this notion of two cultures has been going on and going on and going on, and it's still going on. Do you want to share that?
Well, I'm just going to say one kind of interesting overlap between sleep and anthropology was one of Michael's and my mentors was named Chris Gillen, now deceased, but his father was a world-class anthropologist who took Chris on trips with him as a child to tiny villages throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And his specialty was studying the role of the shaman. And this was the like 50s and 60s, and at that time the model of a psychiatrist was a little different than now. The model then would be a psychoanalyst. But he wrote some really interesting papers about the role of the shaman in the village. And one of them was that actually what the shaman did very often was very much what a modern psychiatrist did in practice. And one example is, the heart of psychoanalysis is that the analyst keeps a very straight face. He doesn't smile at something you said or doesn't frown at something you said. They go to great lengths to learn to have an absolutely flat face. And it's not unlike a shaman wearing a mask, which is so that part of the notion is that the person who is healing you has to, has to be a blank figure. And another one, by the way, is that the shamans, as modern psychiatrists were aware, is that for a patient in therapy to really prosper and do it hard, he has to pay for it. He has to have some skin in the game. Right. That it doesn't work very well when it's free. And there were others too, but he wrote articles suggesting that, in fact, the shaman knew an awful lot about psychotherapy. And another study he did was a big psychological test in those years was the Rorschach test, where they're given a kind of a ink blot, and then they're supposed to say, well, this reminds me of so-and-so. So he would give Rorschachs to an entire village in some of these remote areas and then send them to the U.S., where a panel who was blind as to who was what would read the Rorschachs and say, well, this is a quiet, inhibited person, this is an extrovert, and so on. And it turned out in every village there was one person whose description sounded in Western terms like somebody psychotic. And it was always the shaman. So don't misinterpret the idea of psychotic. That was a very Western image and limited image put on it. But what it really meant, I think, was that there was one person in the village who didn't think like other people and who was more imaginative and creative and thought in different ways. And that was the person who became the shaman. But anyway, I highly recommend to you Gillen, Gillin, if you're interested in that particular type of stuff.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I probably can project my voice enough. It's all right. So, I found this really wonderful to listen to, and one of the things I think I was going with your talk was. Initially, there was this, you post this quote from 1959 of this philosopher who says talking about consciousness during dreaming, is just nonsensical. And so there's this frightened reaction to a sphere of consciousness that is not accessible by what we might call rational introspection. And I think the concern therapeutically, and I'm just curious what you've seen in your people who you're teaching lucid dreaming, is how many people get somewhat unmoored? Because in a certain sense, I mean, your phrasing of it is incredibly elegant. Perception is awake is perception with correction from reality, and dreaming is free. So that idea immediately kind of assaults a certain kind of security, because it presumes that there's a kind of plasticity in our existence which is really formed by the capacities of our mind. It's a little bit like shamanic visioning. And I'm just wondering how many people you're teaching this to experience it as this liberating force where life becomes more plastic, they can use their own internal experiences, they can approach themselves in a novel way. And how many people start to feel like this is really scary, what's real, what's true?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know the answer in general, because some of the people that you're probably talking about will be people maybe that have read my books or have come across the ideas in some other context, and I really don't know. The ones I do know about in terms of being a, say, participant in one of our programs, there we are together in Hawaii, and we've got a pretty good idea of where they're at then, because we talk every day about their experiences and where, what's happening and how they feel. And that seems like a very rare kind of experience where people somehow find it disturbing that the freedom part is just, hard to make sense of, because you can, the different roles are pretty clear though, because you're saying, well, we have specific ways of determining that this particular state, is something you're going to wake up in bed from, and that's the state tests, like the rereading state test, where you look at some writing and look away and look back, and that 75% of the time it changes, and you do that 2 or 3 times, and you say 99 times it'll change. So that gives you a bit of a certainty about, I know which state this is. There are other conditions where you don't know what the state is, but once you've done that, you do have a distinct feeling.
It also gives you a cultural milieu
Yes.
that processes that experience together,
Yes.
which I think is really an interesting
Yes.
phenomena, specifically when you're thinking about this sort of just collective resistance to
Yes.
this idea. Because, arguably, the shaman in the culture is there to bring other worlds
Sure.
in, and the members of the culture aren't all shaman because they need that collective security of their collective reality.
Yeah. So I think you've hit on a big difference in the traditional cultures, where not everybody does dream work. Of course not. It's left to the experts, the shaman, that's the man or woman who understands these things and goes through these dangers and deals with it. Whereas in the context in which we work is really with a social group of people who are sharing support. So it's something that together people are exploring. And so under that circumstances, it seems like it's less threatening. It's something because of its shared nature and this personal support.
I just wanted to make a comment just to remind all of us that etymologically, the word real is related to the word royal, because the king defined what was real. Do you have any question about that? Off with your head. So I think that the challenge in a democratic society, in a world of communication, in cultural respect, is to broaden the conversation and suspend, question a little bit and wonder and wonder if my viewpoint isn't I know it's real. Well, there's no king anymore. That's one of the problems. And how do we deal with this? And I think a respectful conversation is the first step. Questions?
So I wanted to go back to, for a moment, the sleep apnea and lucid dreaming thing, and Bob Abzug's comment earlier about what are the next steps and applications and things like that. There's a very real application to all of the research that y'all are doing, and that is to make a smart Cpap machine. Because as somebody who has sleep apnea, and as somebody who used to induce lucid dreams. And I used to have a lot of lucid dreams. Once I developed sleep apnea, they went away. And I eventually figured out it's because the machine, because it was a continuous air pressure, it couldn't handle the changes in respiration. It would misinterpret the changes in respiration as apnea episodes, and it would crank up the pressure, which would eventually wake me up because the pressure would end up getting too high. So if you could like band together and make a smart CPAP machine that could tell not just the breathing, but maybe adding other physiological parameters to it so that I can have my lucid dreams again, please. Yes. So that's all I wanted to say is a very practical application for the things that y'all are doing. Thank you.
Okay, we could go on forever and ever, but we owe UT to stay within their parameters, and we need a little time to clean up and things like that. But thank you so much for coming. Thanks to our panel.